I mentioned this book in my last video. So even if I think it's one of the worst books that I've read in a really long time, I also mentioned that I wanted to start doing book reports on the books that I read. So here goes. This is not going to be a positive review. I'm warning you right off the bat. So I apologize for all the negativity that is about to come. I'm going to try and keep it spoiler free for the beginning, but then I will be talking about some things that are honestly fairly triggering. So if you have any squeamishness or a faint heart or any childhood trauma or dislike violence towards animals, you should probably not watch this video. To begin with, I judge a book by its cover. The cover looks somewhat compelling. I found all 3 of these books at Half Price Books for $4 each, and boy, am I glad that I found them at Half Price Books and did not spend brand new book money to buy them, because I don't know that I'm ever going to finish this series. This book is about a very traumatized, abused girl who at the beginning doesn't even have a name because she's not worth having a name. She gets sold as a slave and names herself, and is treated differently from the other slaves in the little slave caravan, so she becomes a little bit proud and haughty, and the title of the book is Empress, so it's pretty obvious, I think, that this character, who is our main character, is going to become an empress. And you might think that it's a really nifty story about overcoming adversity and the station of birth to rise above and do things that no one ever expected to you. And while it is a story about that, it's not good. It is extremely character driven, and what plot pushes there are literally deus ex machina. The world building is great, except for the overuse of the word God, God braids, God pillar, God bells. God is in all things, but the word God does not have to be. There are a couple of instances that I cannot stand when a writer, it comes off as lazy to me when you take a word that means the same thing in the fantasy world and our world and you change it very slightly, like changing one letter. That's lazy. Either come up with a new word like you have for other things, or just use the word that we use. Why? It's not even taking the sting out of using a curse word when you change one letter of the word that is distasteful. It's still as distasteful. When we read books, we're trying to identify with a character, and there are very few likable characters in this book. In my opinion, there are a total of 3 likable characters in this book, and spoiler, one of them dies, and the outcome for the other 2 ain't great either. So let's just go straight into spoiler territory for this. So Hecate, as she names herself, like I said, starts to get haughty because she's being treated differently from the other slaves. She doesn't have to walk with them. She rides on the camel with the slave traders, and she's told that she's beautiful. She's dressed differently. She's given a bath. She's taught how to read, all of this stuff. And for a while, that's okay. It looks like she's moving up in the world from cowering nameless under a table where she fears that her biological donor is going to beat her or throw her to the dogs. It's really hard to exist as a person when you are living a life filled with trauma. And part of how most people who live with trauma deal with that is by escapism and distracting oneself. But the character that we are introduced to has no life before the book starts. She has no personality. She has no life. She has nothing to distract her. Literally all she has is what is being told to us in the very beginning of the novel. She didn't have a childhood. She didn't have any moments in which to grow a personality over the course of 12 years. And I understand that the story is about an unbroken spirit, but this is Pain Olympics. Let me be clear. It starts off grim, dark, and gritty, and it continues to be grim, dark, and gritty after the tiniest little bubble of hope. It goes dark, kind of light. Oh no, we're back to dark, and then it stays down at the bottom of the dark light graph for the rest of the book. The main character is absolutely unlikable, and I get that that is the point of this novel. It is to set her up as the villain for the next two, but this didn't have to be a book. We could have learned about her past through passages and hints sprinkled in the other books. It could have been a duology. I have not read the other two books. I've only read like reviews and people trying to defend this book saying, oh, you have to understand how bad it is, you know, from the other country's point of view, because she would just be like a shadow threat. This is 717 pages of cruel exposition. This has no story structure. There's nothing that's learned. Literally every plot point that is pushed is a deus ex machina because the god tells somebody to do it or makes it happen. Every character bickers with the person that they're talking to. Almost every conversation, they act like children, blaming each other for every bad thing that happens, and then they don't. It's so bad from a story perspective. I can't even apologize to Karen Miller because I feel very uncomfortable having been 2/3 of the way through this book and looking her up. This is a book about brown people written by a white woman, including slavery and racism based on skin color. And that makes me uncomfortable. As a white woman, I would rather read a person of color writing about people of color. I think it's a very fine line for a white woman to be writing about brown people doing such atrocious things. I think that it gets very close to demonizing, and that may not have been the intention, but I do think it's a little tone deaf, and I was very off-put by it. There are a few scenes, I wouldn't call them spicy. If they were written differently, then this book might be worthy of some chilies, but it's really dry and kind of glossed over. And there is, trigger warning, a scene where the main character, Hecate, non-consensually forces someone else into an act. This book is an onion of distaste. It's layers and layers upon layers and layers of things that are distasteful. So this book is supposed to be the story of how the slave girl becomes the empress of the tribal desert people and then goes out to conquer the world. Only she doesn't go out to conquer the world. She sends her beloved son and her hated son out to conquer the world. And we get some more descriptions of heinous war crimes committed by and in front of ostensibly the most likable character in the entire book, which is the beloved son. The entire viewpoint of the last part of the book is no longer our main character's viewpoint. It is her son's viewpoint, which is a little jarring. There are a couple other perspective shifts in this book. It's a limited third person, but it's mostly from Hecate's point of view. It switches to other characters when it's convenient for the story, but it doesn't feel like there's any rhyme or reason to the switch in perspective, except that we wouldn't get that perspective if we weren't in their heads at that time. And there's no pattern to it that I can discern, aside from I need to show this to move the story along because otherwise it wouldn't make sense, which I don't like it. I don't like it. The god has no name. It's very cruel. It's represented by a scorpion. The war that they strike out on is a religious war, and they slaughter innocent, peaceful people. Trigger warning. There is also a scene where the most beloved character's love interest, who he has conceived a son upon, is very brutally murdered at the very end of the book, right before he gets repudiated and exiled and basically killed, if not for the actions of the other still living most likable character, who by that point I don't really like him very much anymore. I feel like this book is kind of an instruction manual for what not to do when writing a fantasy story, because this is very, very gritty, and I would call it fantasy because there is magic in it. Is the magic ever explained? No, not really, except to say that the god does it, and that the god empowers people, and there's a magic MacGuffin rock that gets turned into a magic god hammer glove thing that we don't understand how it works or how it's even activated, but we know that some people can do it, and that's why she even has kids to begin with. I won't say that it was a waste of my time, but it is 15 hours that I won't get back. I cannot recommend this book to anyone unless you really like grim, dark stories with basically no hope and main characters that are terrible, unrepentant people who do terrible, horrific atrocities to other people. And like, there's not even a kernel of, ooh, I was sold as a slave, I don't like slavery, let's abolish slavery. No. There are basically no redeeming qualities for the main character, Hakat, and there are very few redeeming qualities for even the most likable characters. It's bad, in my opinion. I gave it 1.25 stars on Storygraph, and I think I was being generous. May you read books that are far more fulfilling to you than this one was to me. Drink some water, eat something delicious and nutritious, and take care of my friend. I promise I will pick a better book next time, and I will do my best to take care of your friends. I love you, and I'll see you next week. There is some, I won't even call it spice in this book, but there are some scenes in this book that, if written differently, would be spicy, including one non-consensual encounter. I threw it on the ground. This ain't my father, it's a cell phone.